Hi, my name is Julia Graf, and this is my financial analysis. In this analysis, I'm going to be looking at 4 different companies: Walmart, Coca-Cola, CVS, and Rite Aid. And I'm going to be looking at 3 different scenarios. In the first scenario, we're going to be looking at a short-term loan. And when looking at who I'd extend a short-term loan to, I'm going to be looking at the liquidity ratios. And this is going to be how quickly assets can be sold without affecting the price of those assets. And we're going to be looking at the current, quick, and cash ratios. So for the current ratio, we want this number to be as high as possible as a bank. We do want this number to be above 1. Walmart for the past 5 years has consistently been below 1, which is not a good sign as a company who is wanting a short-term loan. Rite Aid in 2015 has a current ratio of about 1.7, which means for every dollar they have in liabilities, they have $1.70 in current assets. Since they do have the highest current ratio for the past 5 years, so far as a bank, I'm more willing to lend to Rite Aid. The next ratio we're going to look at is the quick ratio. It's going to be like the current ratio, except we're going to exclude inventory, since inventory is not as liquid as other assets. Since we do this, our ratios are going to drop below 1. As you can tell, all 4 companies do drop below 1, but where I see the most concern is in Rite Aid. On the current ratio, they were at about 1.7, but now in 2015 they're sitting at about 1.45, which is a 1.3 drop. And when comparing that to the drop in other companies, they only dropped about half a point, which is telling me Rite Aid has a lot of their current assets locked into inventory, which is not a good sign. Coca-Cola does have the best quick ratio, sitting at about 0.9, while Walmart does have the worst. The last liquidity ratio we're going to be looking at is going to be the cash ratio, and that is going to be just the cash versus the liabilities. And cash is the most liquid asset a company can have. Now, this one, just like the quick ratio, does not have to be above 1. It's just telling us how much cash do they have on hand that could cover their current liabilities. As you can see, Coca-Cola does have the best cash ratio by far over the other 3 companies. So, in conclusion, for my short-term loan, I would be happy to offer it to Coca-Cola. Even though they don't have the best current ratio, they do have a better quick ratio and cash ratio, so I am most comfortable lending to them. The next scenario we're going to look at is a long-term loan. When looking at long-term loans, we're going to use the debt-to-equity ratio, the debt-to-asset ratio, and the times interest earned ratio. We use the debt-to-equity ratio to show the degree of leverage a company has. It's going to tell us how much money has come from lenders, bankers, investors, and how much money has come from shareholders. A higher debt-to-equity ratio means that the company has more debt. As you can tell, in 2015, Coca-Cola by far has the most debt to equity. But the question we have to ask is, can Coca-Cola afford this debt? The next ratio we're going to look at is going to be the debt to asset ratio. And this ratio is going to tell us how many assets were financed with debt. And just like the debt to equity ratio, the higher the ratio, the more risk is involved. As you can tell, Rite Aid does have more risk when comparing it to the other 3 companies, while Walmart and CVS Health are kind of on the same boat. The last ratio we're going to look at for this scenario is going to be the times interest earned ratio. And this is going to be how many times can a company cover their interest expense. For the past 5 years, Rite Aid has not had a very high times interest earned ratio. In 2015, they could only cover their interest expense 2.5 times, while Coca-Cola over the past 5 years has done a very good job at covering their interest expense. In 2015, however, Walmart, Coca-Cola, and CVS all have about the same times interest earned ratio. In conclusion, for my long-term loan scenario, I would be happy to extend an offer to CVS Health. They have a marginally low debt-to-equity ratio, a lower debt-to-asset ratio, but a very high times interest earned ratio. So I am most comfortable lending to them. For the last scenario, we will be looking at what company I would be interested in investing in. When investing in a company, I'm going to be looking at two main ratios, the return on asset and the return on equity, and what ratios that can be broken down into. The first ratio we're going to look at in this scenario is going to be the return on assets, which is going to be how much a company is making off of the assets it has. As you can tell, Walmart has the highest return on assets, sitting at about 8% in 2015. While Coca-Cola has a lower return on assets. Now, the return on assets can be broken down into two different ratios, the profit margin and the total asset turnover. And we will use these two ratios to tell us what is driving the return on assets. So first is going to be the profit margin. Coca-Cola has a very high profit margin, sitting at 60%, while Walmart has a lower profit margin as well as CVS and Rite Aid. Now, Walmart is known as the low price leader, so it kind of makes sense for Walmart to have a lower profit margin. But it is hard to compare profit margin across different industries. So really, the profit margin only helps us look at CVS Health and Rite Aid, since they are in the same industry. The other part of return on assets is going to be the total asset turnover. And as you can tell, this graph completely flips from the profit margin. Now, the total asset turnover is going to be a measure of efficiency of how they can move those assets in and out their doors. Walmart has a very high total asset turnover, which can account for why they have a very high ROA, as well as Rite Aid also has a very high ROA, and while they also have a high total asset turnover. The next thing we're going to look at is going to be the return on equity, and it's going to tell us how much money is made by the shareholder dollar. Just like return on assets, return on equity can also be broken down. It can be broken down into the equity multiplier and the return on assets. Just like the debt to equity ratio, the equity multiplier is going to tell us how much is debt financing in the company. As you can tell, Coca-Cola in 2015 does have the highest equity multiplier, and CVS does have the lowest. And just like before, we said return on assets can be broken down into the total asset turnover and the profit margin. So in conclusion, for what company I would invest in would be Walmart. And I'm willing to invest in them because while they don't have the highest return on equity, what they do have is a very good asset turnover rate, and they have a good enough profit margin that they don't have to be so financed by debt to be able to create this return on equity.